Today's speaker is Denise DeLuca. Denise has done a bunch of things. She's an author as well as an educator as well as an administrator of various institutes in biomimicry and
biomimetics,
biomimetics, which she'll explain to us. She's got a book as well, Realigning with Nature, which actually Village Books has at least one copy of, so if you rush down there, you might be able to get that while it's still on the shelf. But she'll tell us more about that as well. Please silence your cell phones and direct your attention up here. Thanks, Denise.
All right. Well, thank you. And thanks, everyone, for being here. I know you sort of have to be here in your body, but I hope you're also here with your hearts and your minds, because what I want to share with you tonight is something that's super important to me, so important that I ended up writing a book called Realigning with Nature. Now, I'm the author of the book, but as you can see here, the illustrator is Stephanie Kohler. She did this illustration and all the illustrations in the book. And in fact, the book is about half illustrations if you want to take a look at it. So her visual languaging and visual communication were a really important part of conveying the information in this book. So Stephanie couldn't be here, but she wanted to say hi to all of you guys too. So when I was getting ready to come here, I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about. I wanted to find out what you're about. I mean, I know what I want to talk about, but I want to know what's important to you. So of course I visited your website, and I was looking at things like your mission and your vision, and just what makes you guys special. And one thing that jumped out at me was this quote down here. How many of you have seen that? One hand. Okay, can you read that? No, just kidding. So this is what the quote says. It's a quote by Thomas Henry Huxley, the namesake of the Huxley College of the Environment. And he's talking about what he believes to be a liberal education. He says, education is the instruction of the intellect in the laws of nature, under which name I include not merely things and their forces, but men and their ways, and the fashioning of the affections and of the will into an earnest and loving desire to move in harmony with those laws. Right on, Thomas Henry Huxley. I mean, what a great education you guys are getting. And when I read it, I'm like, okay, I don't even have to look further. This is spot on for what I want to share with you. And really, three phrases from that really jumped out at me. The laws of nature, men and their ways, and in harmony with those laws. Because virtually since I was a little kid, I've been trying to figure these things out, learn about them, wrangle with them, and try to figure out how to fit them all together in practice and in teaching. Well, let's start with the laws of nature. I started learning about the laws of nature as a really little kid. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and back in the 60s and 70s, it was perfectly legal to throw your kid out the door in the morning and say, hey, I'll see you home at dinner time. And in the interim, we would go to the woods, or we'd meet at the field, or our favorite was to hang out at the swamp. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have similar experiences, right? You learn about nature firsthand by just playing in it, right? So you know the laws of nature. And I was lucky too, because both my parents were scientists. My mom was a bacteriologist, my dad was a biochemist. So I learned a lot of science and biology type stuff at home, and I was kind of nerdy as a kid, and so I'd read all their science books. And my parents were also naturalists, so we'd go on nature walks and do plant identification and look at little pieces of fungus and just spend a lot of time outside as a kid. And I had this love of nature and the laws of nature, which I carry with me today. And I'm sure that's why all of you guys are here. I learned about men and their ways as I got older, of course. Don't we all? But also, in addition to being scientists and naturalists, my parents were social activists. So I learned that men and their ways resulted in things like the Vietnam War and the military-industrial complex and Watergate and pollution. And as a young adult, I ended up learning that men and their ways could make life pretty difficult for women and their ways. I learned that to be in harmony with those laws, you either had to fight the system or leave the system. I mean, you could try and live in harmony with those laws, with the laws of nature at home, in your own backyard, or in your kitchen, or little pockets of fellow hipsters, which I'm sure you have around here in Bellingham. But it seemed like men and their ways were ever present and all powerful. They set the rules of the game, they run the show. And they certainly don't seem to have an earnest and loving desire to move in harmony with the laws of nature. Quite the contrary. Well, I went on to become a civil and environmental engineer. That's what my master's degree is in. And my job was to figure out how to interface the laws of nature with men and their ways, and vice versa. But because of my own earnest and loving desire to move in harmony with the laws of nature, I went on to study things like environmental remediation, sustainable resource management, and biomimicry and biomimetics. How many of you have heard of biomimicry before? Oh, wow, quite a few of you. For those who haven't heard of it, it's also called innovation inspired by nature. And it's the practice that like engineers, designers, architects, and others do, that if they try to solve a problem, they say, well, how does nature solve that problem? What strategies does nature use? And take those strategies and apply them in your design world so you could design products and processes that are more sustainable and certainly more innovative. Well, I thought, oh, this is great, biomimicry or biomimetics. I could create technologies that follow the laws of nature. And in that way, I could get men and their ways to move in harmony with those laws. Right on, problem solved. Well, theoretically, that's true, but in practice, I found that wasn't always possible. Because what I found was that men and their ways had this tendency to resist being in harmony with the laws of nature, even technologies inspired by nature. I also learned that even if I could create technologies that were sustainable and boosted the bottom line, or even the triple bottom line, it just wasn't enough. I would still face this resistance. And this was incredibly frustrating. Have you guys experienced something of the same? You got this fantastic idea and like it should work and still you get this resistance? Like, what's that about? And I was frustrated with this for a long time, as was many of my peers. But I had this one experience that really turned my way of thinking. I was working for a company called Swedish Biomimetics 3000. The difference between biomimetics and biomimicry is that they both take inspiration from nature, but biomimicry's goal is sustainability, and biomimetics isn't. They just want to do something more innovative and commercial. So I was working for Swedish Bio, and my project was to come up with a packaging material that was that could be recycled with paper. It could be composted, and it had to be vegan. In other words, it couldn't use any animal products or waste products like old seashells or anything like that. So we worked our magic, we came up with this stuff, and we were working for this big, huge global conglomerate that makes food and beverages that everyone knows of. And we showed them our stuff. They're like, whoa, this is amazing. We've been working at this for 10 years, and you've done it right on. We're gonna get the beverage team on. So we're talking to the beverage team about how we're gonna do it. They said, you know what, this is too big for us. We need to go global. We gotta talk to the global guys. Of course, they're guys. And so we're in this conference call, and the regional team was presenting what we did, and we presented, and it was all great. And the global guys go, oh, this is fantastic. Thanks for your work. End of project. We're like, what? I mean, the other guy, the regional office, was even more stunned than we were. Sorry for hitting that. And I'm like, okay, it doesn't matter how good it is, what you come up with. No matter how many boxes it ticks, how much money it would make, there's something else going on here. And I thought, I've got to figure this out, otherwise I'll never make any headway changing the world. Well, after lots of conversations with lots of people over lots of cups of coffee and glasses of wine, I finally learned that what I needed to do was the other thing that Huxley was talking about: focus on the fashioning of the affections and of the will into an earnest and loving desire to be in harmony with those laws. I figured out that I couldn't use old school thinking and old school approaches to forwarding ideas if I really wanted to forward radical thinking and radical innovation. It just isn't going to work, especially if those ideas have to do with sustainability. Well, because I knew about the incredible power of biomimicry, I decided I'm going to look back to nature to try and figure out the answer to this conundrum. So I worked with colleagues and teammates and friends and people around the world, as well as students and family and friends. People got sick of me talking about this, but among all of us, some stuff started to emerge that I thought was really interesting. And what I ended up calling it was Realigning with Nature, Ecological Thinking for Radical Transformation. And I really did not try and win an award for as many syllables in a book title as possible. But, and I thought, I gotta share all this thinking with the world, so I decided to put together a book. And that's this book, which is available for you guys. And I say put together a book because I started writing a book, you know, writing, and I was getting really bogged down. And I don't know if you've mentioned this, but I'm an adjunct faculty at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design in their Master's in Sustainable Design program. And it's a completely online program, that's why I can be here and teach there at the same time. It's mostly working designer professionals who got frustrated with doing damage in the world. It's like, I want a Master's in Sustainable Design, so that's what that's about. But one challenge they have is they have to write a master's thesis. How many of you are having to write long papers or theses? Okay, so can you imagine if you don't ever write, you only create, and you've got to write? So they would get super bogged down, and I would give them this great advice. I said, look, whatever your best form of expression is, whether it's drawing or rendering or creating, whatever it is, do that, and then tell someone why you did what you did and what it's all about, and then have them type it or use voice recognition software. And I go, oh my gosh, that's great. And so then people would write their thesis that way. And when I got bogged down, I took my own advice. I'm like, okay, I'm putting this whole thing away. I'm gonna start over again. And I love to draw and create visual expressions of things. So during last season's, not this season's, but the previous season's Seahawks game on Sundays, I would draw. and then I ended up doing it in PowerPoint, and in the speaker notes became the text. And so I wrote the whole book in PowerPoint. And the publisher said, I like what you're doing with this. Nobody reads big books anymore, but your illustrations, so I hired Stephanie Kohler, who was a former student of mine at AMCAD, to do all the illustrations. So you could see how the PowerPoint with speaker notes turned into a book. So this little clue is if you get bogged down writing, that's something you can do. Okay, so that's how the book came to be. Let's go back to Huxley's quote. And when he said men and their ways, what I referred to in the book is the real world. Have you ever heard the expression, welcome to the real world? And do people say, hey, welcome to the real world? No, they say, yeah, well, welcome to the real world, right? It's like you've got some great idea or some great project, you're trying to forward it out there in the real world, and something goes wrong and it fails, and people say, yeah, well, welcome to the real world. You know what I'm talking about, right? So it's like, what is this real world that we're supposed to be welcomed to? I mean, really, what assumptions are we making about the world when we use that expression, welcome to the real world? We all know what this means, and we all probably use that expression. So I'm like, that's kind of curious. And so what I did was I looked behind, like, what is the thinking behind this real world? And in the book, I call it the conventional paradigm. Now, I came up through the engineering world, not in liberal arts, so I had to kind of get a sense of really what a paradigm is. And if you don't know, a paradigm is like your mental model of the world. It's a set of assumptions you make about the way the world works. And often you're unaware of your own paradigm because everyone else around you has pretty much the same paradigm. You don't really get what your paradigm is until you're thrown into a completely different situation. Well, what I'm calling the conventional paradigm is the mental model behind what we call the real world. It's the thinking behind the mess that we're in. And by mess, I mean things like environmental destruction, climate change, and conspicuous overconsumption, that's led to social inequity and all the other kind of mess that I'm sure a lot of you guys are trying to tackle. And I describe the conventional paradigm as having these 6 elements: scarcity, individuality, competition, greed, resistance, and fear. And they're all interconnected and interdependent. Of all those, the one that probably is the biggest driver for many of us is scarcity. And we all know that resources are limited and there's not enough to go around, right? That's an assumption we tend to make. And individuality. You might be working on teams or told to collaborate, but you kind of know that in the end, you got to look out for yourself, right? Because you're judged, you're rewarded, you're punished as an individual. And of course, we've all been in competition, since we were little kids. School is always set up as a competition. We're in sports, and most workplaces try to actually induce competition because they think it's going to drive more performance. And of course, in a world where there's scarcity and individuality, of course you're in competition. And greed. Well, in our economy, our consumerist, capitalistic economy, greed is sort of imperative. It's what makes our economy run. You may think, well, I'm not greedy, but how many of you got to go for that next opportunity. You got to climb the ladder. You got to get a lot while you can, right? I mean, that's kind of why you're in school, partly. And then resistance. With this world out there, if there's a change that happens, and of course change always happens, often our first response is resistance. Because we don't know what that change is going to do, and we think something's going to be taken away from us, or we're going to get in trouble. We're going to, that greed kicks in too. So we got resistance, and then fear. I'm guessing most of you don't say, oh, I'm a fearful person. But how many of us don't feel stress or worry some of the time, or maybe a lot of the time? So this is the conventional paradigm, what I believe is the thinking behind the real world. And the thing about it is it's kind of a paranoid worldview. And in this conventional paradigm, in the real world, people tend to shoot first and ask questions later. Or they tweet first and don't ask questions at all. And the conventional paradigm plays out in different ways in our culture. We're all familiar with the conventional model for leadership. The conventional leader is a guy who makes the tough decisions, who knows all the answers, who makes the tough calls, who saves the day, saves the company, saves the day. And we treat the conventional leader like a hero. And we love having these heroes out there. But of course, the conventional leader isn't a hero. He, and it's usually he, doesn't sacrifice himself for the greater good. He sacrifices others for the good of himself. And interestingly, kind of curiously, even though we tend to love heroes, we've got movies about them, we expect our leaders to be heroes, we, as individuals, tend to walk around in victim mode. And I'm sure you're going, me? I don't do that. But how many of you during the day today said, nah, 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 nah? A lot of blaming and complaining goes on. It's our common bond. It's our cultural norm. We do a lot of blaming and complaining. Oh, it's their fault. I couldn't get a parking spot. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough time. It's their fault. Do you guys do that? Okay, we all do it. It's just our cultural norm. But sadly, people like you and me who try and work for a greater good and try and be the change we want to see in the world, blaming and complaining leads to shame. And that's really pretty debilitating way to be in the world. And you may say, I'm not like that. I really truly live my values. I'm more enlightened than that. I don't get caught up in the conventional, trappings of the conventional world. And good for you if you do. And if you can accomplish that. But so many of us live on the edge, of course, with all this stress and worry, and it doesn't take much to tip us back into that conventional way of thinking and being and behaving. And for many of us, some people it's greed, but I think for many of us it's fear, it's the stress and worry that sets us off, and then one thing sets off another, and it's this downward spiral. The conventional paradigm also affects our way of thinking about sustainability. You guys all care about sustainability, right? Yeah, so you study it, you probably know way more about it than me, but I would say this is kind of the most simple way you can represent sustainability. On the y-axis, you've got business, you've got profit or performance, and on the x-axis, you've got people on the planet. And it's pretty much a tug of war. So if you want to get 10 in business, you pretty much have to exploit people in the environment. That's business as usual. It's how we conduct our business. And if you want pristine environment and you want to have a world that's totally fair to everyone, equality, a 10 on that scale, you pretty much can't have business because, again, they can't exist without exploiting people in the environment. So we have this line drawn between them. It's one or the other. Now, if you're an optimist, and I'm guessing some of you are, you're like, business can be a force for good. We can have that curve out there. You can make money and be okay with people in the environment. But if people who are activists or in the business world are a little bit more paranoid than that, and they think it's a slippery slope, it's that lower curve. If I give a little, they're going to take a lot. So you fight all environmental regulations. You fight all business. Does that sound kind of familiar? Okay, I know it's simplistic, but I think that kind of captures it. The thing about this view of sustainability is nobody believes you can have a 10 in business and a 10 on the people planet scale. Under the conventional paradigm, sustainability is an impossibility theorem. You can't cut down all the trees and have a forest. So now let's talk about the laws of nature. Of course, you guys know a lot about nature. That's what you study. And I'm not a biologist. I'm an engineer, but I'm an environmentalist, and I've worked in biomimicry or innovation inspired by nature. And I have learned some really curious things about the laws of nature that have really changed my thinking and changed my assumptions about the world, both as an engineer and as an environmentalist. For example, efficiency. As an engineer, you're very concerned about efficiency. You're looking at how much output can you get for your input from whatever device you're making. So you have your output in the numerator and your input in the denominator. You want to get as close to 100% as possible. Now, as an environmentalist, of course, you're concerned about efficiency too, right? Energy efficiency, fuel efficiency. You want cars to have as many miles per gallon as possible. And as environmental scientists, we all know that nature is efficient, right? Everyone would agree with that? I mean, it's totally efficient. There is no waste in nature. But if that's the case, how would you measure the efficiency of an apple tree? What would go in the numerator? What would go in the denominator? It's not that simple, is it? Nature doesn't really work that way. And I kept trying to figure this out, and then I'm like, maybe nature isn't efficient. Maybe efficiency isn't the goal in nature, at least the way we understand and measure efficiency with a numerator and a denominator. How many of you would say consumption is bad and waste is bad? We're going to use reusable water bottles. We do recycling, right? How many of you work on efforts to reduce consumption and waste? Yeah, I'm guessing a lot of you do. You probably do it in your personal lives too. As well you should, because consumption and waste are bad in the real world. But what about this worm here? Is consumption bad for the worm? Or bad for the world if the worm consumes? What about the worms that are in your garden or in your compost pile or in the soil? Don't we want them to consume and make more healthy soil? Isn't their waste exactly what we want? We want them to consume and waste more. And what about that apple tree? Is that apple that never gets eaten or doesn't turn into a tree, is that waste? So again, this was really challenging my assumption. Maybe waste and consumption is actually good in nature. So what does that tell us? In competition, we all know there's competition in nature. There's pecking orders and hierarchies and survival of the fittest. So of course, there's competition in nature. But if competition runs nature, how could we have forests and flocks and swarms in schools? How could you have lawns on campus? So this was really getting to be perplexing. I mean, I know you guys all spend time in nature. Think about the last time you were out in nature. When was the last time you saw outright competition in nature? Why do we call it a dog-eat-dog world? How many of you have ever seen a dog eat another dog? So what I was learning by studying the laws of nature is that the way we understand and measure and value the world with a conventional paradigm simply does not jive with how we measure and understand and value the world as scientists, as environmentalists, and simply as human beings. So when you take a closer look at it, the real world doesn't seem so real anymore. So what I sought out to do is to figure out, what is nature's paradigm? What do the organisms in nature assume to be true about the world? What's their mental model that makes what seems so perplexing to us make total sense with the laws of nature, so they can, of course, live in harmony with those laws? And what I came up with, I called nature's paradigm. I started, writing about it, and at one point I'm like, wait a minute. Humans are biological beings. We are part of nature. We are nature. Nature's paradigm is our natural paradigm. And that was a big aha for me. And you know what the natural paradigm is because it's yours. It's what you're thinking about when you're not thinking about it. It's your worldview, kind of the way you kind of look at the world when you're out walking in nature, or when you're way into music, or maybe you're doing something creative, or falling in love. It's your worldview when you are being you. And like the conventional paradigm, the natural paradigm I've described as 6 elements, which are, of course, in contrast to the conventional paradigm. Of course, we know there's scarcity of resources in nature, but organisms in nature, their worldview is abundance. They are hardwired to grow and reproduce until they can't. And as we said, we haven't seen a dog eat another dog, but of course there's competition in nature, but by far the predominant relationship type is some form of synergy. And that's because everything in nature operates as systems, and systems of systems, and all interconnected and interdependent. There is no such thing as an individual organism in nature. Nothing can survive on its own. And of course, there's forms of resistance in nature, but there is no way we could have humans could be on Earth today if organisms didn't adapt and evolve over time and continue to go with the flow, be able to bounce back from change as opposed to simply resist it. And curiosity. Certainly there's fear in nature. I know I've been afraid in nature before, but there never could have been human beings, let alone have human beings all over the earth doing what we've done, even the good things, if the sense of curiosity didn't far outweigh our sense of fear. And trust. That seems like a big one to humans, but it's kind of simple in nature. Every single organism can trust that every other organism in nature will always abide by the laws of nature. Because if you don't, you're going to go extinct. Nature's pretty harsh that way. So everything in nature can trust everything else in nature to do what it's supposed to do. Now, if we operated in accordance with our own natural paradigm in harmony with the laws of nature, you could look out for number 1 and everyone else too, and know that everyone else will be doing the same. I think it was Paul Hawken that said, there is no unemployment in nature. If we lived in accordance with our natural paradigm and our organizations and our systems did the same, we wouldn't have to worry about things like the butterfly effect or black swan events. And sustainability. Remember that XY graph I showed you? If we designed things in accordance with natural laws and we lived according to our natural paradigm, we could bust out of the stupid constraints of the conventional paradigm. We'd add a z-axis to that graph I showed you. And that z-axis would have things like curiosity, inspiration, creativity, imagination, beauty, delight, joy, knowledge, purpose, love. All these things are super precious resources, but they're all abundant. The more you give away, the more you get. The more you use them up, the more they grow. And with that, with all this, that z-axis, added, you get amazing stuff happening that busts the pants off of both the business side and our kind of our limited view of protecting people and the environment. And if we, as designers, whether it's products or processes or policies, if we design things in accordance with natural laws, we could design devices and technologies and innovations and, like I said, policies that are not only work in harmony with nature's laws, but they'd be smart and beautiful. Now, how many of you think this is like super idealistic, maybe even kind of fantastical? I didn't say fanatical, but maybe that too. But I would argue that the biggest economic gains we've made in the past couple of decades have come from a few individuals and organizations tapping into and expressing the natural paradigm. And you guys, your generation, knows exactly what that's all about, and that's the internet. You think about the power of the internet isn't from how many devices you have, how much copper wire you can string, right? It's not about that. It's about the ability to share knowledge and joy and curiosity. The problem we're having with spending so much time on screens is because we give and we give and we give. How many of you guys just load stuff onto the internet all day, every day, right? Pictures, tweets, whatever stuff you guys use. I'm old, so I don't know all these things. But you do that because you feel like you're getting back more than you're giving. The only limit to the potential and the power and the good that we can do through the internet is because of the constraints of our conventional thinking. So what I'm arguing is that between the conventional paradigm and the natural paradigm, we can shift men and their ways from inhibiting or resisting the laws of nature to working in harmony with those natures by making that shift from the conventional to the natural paradigm. Now, clearly, that's a radical transformation. But because nature already exists, and you guys in particular really understand that nature is the real world, right? That it's going to be easier than you'd think. And I think we should follow the advice of Buckminster Fuller. Do you guys know Buckminster Fuller? Look him up. He's kind of the original, biomimicry environmental guy. He was the buckyball, that kind of geodesic dome, wildly ahead of his time. He's a generation or two ahead of me, but what he said was that in order to change an existing paradigm, what I'm calling the conventional paradigm, don't try and struggle to change the problematic model. Create a new model and make the old one obsolete. And the really cool thing about that is we don't even have to create a new model. It already exists out there in nature and in here in our own human nature. How many of you guys know that nature works in cycles? Okay, we know that. It's not linear. But I would argue that change in nature, transformation, is really would take a spiral shape because, of course, the end point isn't exactly the same as the starting point. So you end up with this spiral. It starts with little changes and gets bigger and bigger. So I would say that change in nature and transformation takes a spiral form. So I adopted that as my way of figuring out how to shift from one paradigm to the next. And this is what I came up with, and we'll go backwards to see how it works. So if you want to shift a paradigm, you need to shift a culture. And to shift a culture, you need to shift individual and collective habits. And to develop a new habit, you've got to practice something new until it becomes a habit. And if you want to practice something new, you've got to learn something new. So it's simple. You learn something new, all this bio stuff. You practice it till it becomes a habit, and then your friends start to do it, and it becomes part of your culture. It becomes a social norm, and paradigms shift, okay? But of course, change isn't easy, especially big radical transformation type change. And we know that no matter how badly we want to do something, make a change in our life, it's really easy to fall off that. How many of you guys made New Year's resolutions and have already dropped them? That kind of change is hard no matter how bad you want it. So like, okay, nature is really good at change. Nature is really good at transformation. So again, I looked to nature to figure this out. And again, I came up with something that challenged my previous assumptions. How many of you know or believe that one of the reasons why business is so bad is because they're too short-sighted? They don't look out for the long term. Okay, we all say that, right? That's an assumption that we make in the real world. That's true. But nature obviously is in it for the long haul. It's been around for a few billion years. But nature is also in it for the short term and the very short term. Would your blood ever stop flowing because you've got some big project to do? No, of course not. So nature is very concerned with the long term and in the medium term and the short term and the instantaneous all the time and all at the same time in perfect synchronicity. Like, okay, that's the clue. Whatever you do in the short term has to have value in the short term. Every breath you take has value while also be aligned with the bigger goal. The thing is, it doesn't have to be super obvious that the value you gain in the short term is feeding into the longer goal. So every step along the way, you have to add real-time value in the context and in the value system in which you're working. And so what I learned to do is take the tools of biomimicry, which are originally designed to design cool things, and apply them to organizational structures and leadership models. And I would teach people through the tools of biomimicry how to be more creative, how to be more collaborative, how to do systems thinking, design thinking. And you could do it in 5 minutes and have amazingly productive meetings. And people feel creative and they're talking to each other and it's great. Like, wow, what was that? It's like, nothing, it was just a really good meeting. But what they're doing is they're experiencing the natural paradigm, which not only feels really good, but it's super productive and powerful. So little by little, people keep practicing it because it keeps delivering value and on around the spiral. So that's how I believe we can make teams and organizations and eventually the whole world shift from the natural paradigm to the conventional paradigm. How many of you are in school in part because you want to change the world? You want to make the world a better place? Good for you. Big, big goal, right? But what I have learned, especially when I've done, applied this to leadership, that you got to start with yourself. You have to transform yourself before you can transform the world. And what I recommend in the epilogue of the book, and if I ever get around to writing another book, it's going to be the personal manual to personal transformation. But what you do is you spend a little bit of time noticing your natural paradigm, the words you say, your practices, your mental model, and then notice how you believe and express the conventional model. When do you feel fear, greed, resistance, scarcity, competition? Start to notice when you're behaving that way, when you're complaining, when you're blaming, and then go, I'm doing it again, aren't I? And when you feel scarcity, think, well, what's abundant? What do I have lots of that I could give away and actually have more of that would actually help me get something done today? When I feel worry or stress, instead of going, oh, I'm so worried about this, you could say, I wonder if, or I wonder about. So start to notice the difference in your thinking and your behavior in your own world, and then notice the immediate value that it delivers while it's also freeing you from the constraints of conventional thinking and letting your own natural paradigm shine through. The differences between these two paradigms is really stark. And the consequences of the world operating according to this paradigm are tremendous. And it's become alarmingly apparent since, say, January 20th. So, those of you who are preparing to enter the real world, and those of you who are teaching and helping others prepare to enter the real world, when someone rolls out that welcome mat, welcome to the real world, you're like, oh, I gotta climb that ladder. I gotta beat the competition. I gotta win that game. That's all right, but be thinking about where you're going with that and what kind of world you wanna live in and what kind of world you wanna create. And I would urge you to visit your website again and see what Huxley has to say, because I think it's just wonderful. What he said is, learn what is true to do what is right. And in the language of my book, I would say, think ecologically to transform radically and realign with nature. Thank you.